Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our February 8th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode is going to introduce you to an under-the-radar federal proposal that could have cut some farmers' access to conservation cost-share funding and even crop insurance if Farm Bureau hadn't stepped in to challenge it. This episode also features useful tips from a renowned researcher who advises major food and farming brands like Costco, Kroger, Chick-fil-a, Corteva, and Farm Bureau on the latest consumer trends and insights into building trust. So let's start right there with Charlie Arnot, the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity. When Charlie speaks about consumer trends and building trust, the major food and farming brands listen. Let's hear what he has to say. Farm Bureau's Zach Bader has the story.
Today we welcome Charlie Arnot back to the Spokesman Speaks podcast. Charlie is the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity, and he's been gracious enough to join us on the podcast in the past. And so thanks for joining us again, Charlie. And for those who aren't familiar with the Center for Food Integrity, tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. It's great to be back with you again, and always appreciate the opportunity to engage with Iowa Farm Bureau. The Center for Food Integrity is an international nonprofit dedicated to helping the food system earn consumer trust. We believe that trust is any organization's most valuable intangible asset, and we have to work to maintain it and build it on an ongoing basis. We are truly a food system organization. Our board of directors includes companies like Costco and Kroger and Sysco and Chick-fil-a, as well as others like Corteva and Bayer and the National Pork Board and Dairy Farmers of America. So both food system interests and agricultural interests are represented, including Sarah Payne from the Iowa Farm Bureau. And it's helpful because it gives everyone an opportunity to look at food system issues from a different perspective. And we think that's very healthy. We work to provide tools and training and other support, consumer research, and other tools to help the food system continue to work on improving consumer trust all the way from farm to fork.
And you mentioned that research, and of course, over this past year, been no shortage of interesting research to do. Throughout 2020, the Center for Food Integrity really kept its finger on the pulse of consumer insights as we endured a pandemic and social unrest. What consumer trends are on the horizon that you're seeing in 2021 that folks in the food system should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that are really continuations of what we saw in 2020. One of our members said that the changes they expected to see in 5 years happened in 5 months. And a number of those were accelerated in a way that kind of fundamentally changed the structure of the food system. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk more about kind of consumer insight and perception as well. Probably the biggest shift is omni-channel shopping and the shift from food service to in-home dining and in-home eating. So Sysco, as I mentioned before, is one of our members. And they provide food and other services and goods to restaurants all around the country. They saw 70% of their business dry up in 5 days when the pandemic was starting and we saw the lockdowns initiated around the country, when people just simply stopped eating out. And that business just cratered. At the same time, another member, Kroger, added 100,000 employees over 8 weeks in all of their operations to accommodate all of the additional click and collect or click and pick, where we order online and we drive through to pick up our groceries that happened across their operation. So a fundamental change in terms of how we eat, where we're getting our food, all of that shifted and is a change that we think is likely to continue as we've all become more comfortable by ordering food online, picking it up at the grocery store, having meal kits delivered direct to consumer, whether we're buying from our favorite restaurant or from a specialty vendor. All of that has fundamentally changed the way that consumers think about, purchase, and consume food. So the channels through which we buy food have fundamentally changed. The other big shift is consumers increasing concern around a number of different issues. So, sustainability is a big topic for agriculture, right? And we tend to think about sustainability primarily as environmental attributes and what's in the environment that we need to manage and what's the impact on our production operations. Now, the food system still thinks about it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and our ability to impact climate change, but consumers are thinking about it somewhat differently today. It's gone from what's in the environment that could harm the planet to what's in the environment that could harm me and my family. So it's going to renew those concerns around things like the use of pesticides or animal health products in livestock operations or other things that might enter the food system. And we've seen that in some recent research that we've done around pesticide use and a concern that consumers have that it's actually entering animal protein products. That somehow, because the pesticides are used on crops and the animals consume the crops, that the pesticides are getting into meat and poultry and eggs and dairy products. Now, we know that's not true, but whether or not it's true doesn't change that that's a perception. So I think consumer concern about production practices and how they impact consumers' health and well being, and then the increased interest in immune health. As we're all facing the pandemic and looking for ways, in addition to being vaccinated and social distancing, to protect ourselves and our families, there's a greater interest in immune health. And I think that's a great place for agriculture to engage and tell that story about what we're doing to make sure the food we are producing is healthy and contributes to human health and actually improving the health of our planet as well.
So let's kind of continue on that sustainability conversation. That's an interesting way of framing it. Like you said, talking about what's in the environment and how does that impact me. And we know, of course, in agriculture that farmers have an excellent story to tell when it comes to sustainability, improving what they're growing and what they're raising, doing more with fewer resources. So having that knowledge in mind of how consumers are perceiving sustainability, how can farmers show that they're sustainable in a way that's going to resonate with consumers?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zach. And I mentioned, to you earlier that I'm going to be working with a group in agriculture in another state next week, and it's fascinating to see how their plan has changed. The previous strategic plan called on them to defend agriculture from attack. Their new plan talks about how their strategy is to build trust in farming and food production. And it's a really pivotal shift. And I think it's crucial when you think about what we need to do in agriculture to change our mindset, to understand how can we be more successful in this conversation. It's not about defending our systems and what we do from attack. It's about helping people understand that we are in fact trustworthy. So you're absolutely right. Farmers have an amazing track record of producing more, using less every single year. And we understandably feel a bit defensive when people who don't know a lot about agriculture attack us for those practices. But rather than becoming defensive and responding to that attack, we can go back to the understanding about what it takes to build trust and acknowledge people's concerns about the environment, acknowledge their concerns about farming practices, and then we're given permission to engage them in that conversation in a way that helps build trust. So rather than attacking someone who says, well, I'm really concerned about all the chemicals and the greenhouse gas emissions, rather than attacking and responding with all the data and the facts, to simply respond to say, I really appreciate that concern. As a farmer, I share the same concern. I'm concerned about our impact on the environment. I want to make sure that I leave the planet better for my family and for future generations. So we share that same concern about environment and making sure that food production is sustainable. Let me share with you some of the things we're doing on our farm to make sure that happens. And then you can talk about precision farming and the fact that we use fewer resources and our conservation of water and our protection of water quality and the way that we raise animals in a way that reduces the amount of inputs required. All of those things contribute to the story, but the critical thing, Zach, is the approach that we take in that conversation so that it's not one of defending from attack or responding defensively, but it's embracing that skepticism and identifying where we share the same concerns and the same values, and then talking about what we actually do in farming today to meet the expectations that consumers have that we will produce safe, healthy, nutritious food and protect the planet and do what's right for animals. And we do all of that every day across Iowa on every farm. So being able to tell that story in a way that builds trust is absolutely essential if we're going to be successful.
that's the long-standing research that Center for Food Integrity has shared with us, has shared with farmers, a proven way of building trust. In the current environment we're in, of course, we're dealing with so many different threats to trust out there. COVID-19, social unrest has probably accelerated some of that erosion of a trust kind of across the board. So from your perspective, looking at the research, has this current environment, has that impacted the trust that people have in the food system and in farmers? And if so, do those same principles, I assume, just kind of hearing you go through that, the same principles still apply as far as how to build up that trust as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really great question. And if you look at the latest research from Edelman and others, what you find is that trust in our institutions, be they government or other institutions, has really cratered. But trust in business continues to fare very well, and research shows that trust in farmers continues to be very, very strong. So farmers start that conversation with the benefit of the doubt. So when we engage in that conversation, we start with some significant capital in our trust bank, and so we can build on that and continue to build on that trust that we can currently enjoy. But it has to be by about embracing those shared values, making sure we communicate the fact that we care about the same things that are important to consumers, and then talking about how we actually farm on a day-to-day basis to make sure we do what's right for the planet, we do what's right for consumers, we do what's right for animals. So it's a proven methodology. We just have to stay that course and resist the urge to respond defensively, because farmers are such great storytellers. The farmers that that live on the land and produce the food have such a great story to tell, and so it's compelling. The story is compelling, and the storytellers are compelling. So they are great people to be engaged in this conversation and really build trust in the food system, and also overcome that bias against size and scale. We know that people are concerned about the size and scale of agriculture, but we also know that communicating values trumps that bias against size and scale. And so if we are successful in telling the story of the men and women who are out there every day, making it happen on our farms, it does overcome that bias, and it does help build trust in the food system. And the benefit to farmers then is they continue to have the ability to use the technology they use today and the technology that's being developed for future years as well.
I want to build on that just a little bit and then kind of pivot back a little bit to the sustainability conversation as well. So, of course, sustainability is sometimes used as a justification for those who are encouraging maybe others to eat less meat or start consuming plant-based imitation meat products. Do you see plant-based protein options replacing animal protein in the research that you're doing, or is it just providing consumers with more choice? This is obviously an issue that's just really top of mind for especially the livestock farmers out there. And I think it does tie into that sustainability discussion and how consumers perceive it as well.
It absolutely does. And I was having a conversation with Jason Lusk last week, one of the preeminent economists around agriculture, around this conversation. He said, the category has actually grown some. And so what we're actually seeing is people are consuming animal protein, and perhaps they're trying plant-based protein as well. So the increase in flexitarians, those who are comfortable eating meat, but are also wanting to do something that makes them feel better about the food choices they make, is an opportunity for those of us in livestock production. I think we've taken the path again of choosing to attack plant-based protein, and I certainly understand that. I think the other real opportunity here is to understand that this is a game of addition, not division. If we force people to make a choice, whether they buy animal protein or plant-based protein, we run the risk that they're going to choose not to buy animal protein any longer. If we tell them it can be both and here's why you can actually get the macronutrients and the micronutrients you need from animal protein, and here's what animal protein is doing to protect our environment and be more sustainable, and here's why it provides great value for you and your family, then you're giving them permission to feel comfortable making the animal protein purchases that they want to make. So again, it's all about the how we choose to engage and respond to this conversation, rather than attacking and defending. To invite the conversation, we say, you know what? We appreciate the fact that you're looking for more nutrient-dense food. We appreciate the fact you're looking for food that is actually better for you and better for the planet. Let me share with you the story of what we produce in the beef industry or the pork industry or the dairy industry or the egg industry. and why it's a really complete nutrient dense food that gives you what you need to enhance your immunity, which we know is important to you. And by the way, we actually are taking better care of the environment today than we ever have. And we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and we're reducing our environmental footprint every single year. And to tell that story in a way that continues to give those consumers permission to be comfortable purchasing the animal protein products we know they enjoy.
I like the way you phrase that, framing this as an addition rather than division. And with so much of what's happening in the world right now, it can feel a little overwhelming and hard to know where to start, and can be hard to not feel like you're on the defensive at times. And so when it comes to engaging consumers, as we wrap up here, what are some things just some basics, where would you encourage farmers to start and to focus as they look to build a bridge with a non-farm audience during these really unprecedented times?
Yeah, great question. So we have a very simple 3-step process: listen, ask, share. So when a consumer or someone in a non-farm audience begins to raise questions or raise issues, we tend to listen and want to respond very quickly with corrected information, right? We want to set the record straight instead of really listening for what's the underlying value that person is expressing. Well, I'm just concerned about greenhouse gas emissions and I'm concerned about climate change and agriculture's impact on that. Okay, well, what we hear there is they're really concerned about the environment. Then we ask for clarification. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. What I hear you saying is what you're really concerned about is the impact of agriculture on the environment. Is that accurate? And they go, well, yeah, that's it exactly. Well, great. Now we share, right? So it's listen, ask, share. So now we're given permission to share the story about how ag is better for the environment today than it's ever been before, and we continue to make improvements every single year. So that listen, ask, share provides a framework that allows us to listen for the values, to ask questions for clarification, and then to share information that address the underlying question or concern that a consumer may have, all while making sure we want to embrace their concern and never be defensive or attacking in responding.
We know that farmers appreciate a proven strategy, one that's backed by research, whether they're in the field or engaging with a consumer audience online. So it's always good to have Charlie on the podcast to survey the current environment and connect the dots to an effective approach for consumer engagement that's based on the research. We appreciate Charlie coming back on the podcast, and we hope that you heard something there that gives you confidence and a bit of direction as you engage with the non-farmers in your life. Helping you share your farm story more effectively is one of the many things we take pride in here at Farm Bureau. We also take a lot of pride in being your watchdog and advocating for you when you can't be there to advocate for yourself. And that leads us to our second guest, Iowa Farm Bureau's Rick Robinson. Recently, Rick and Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel sat down and discussed a little-known NRCS proposal that could have resulted in big problems if Farm Bureau hadn't been there to step in.
We're visiting today with Rick Robinson, Iowa Farm Bureau's Conservation and Natural Resources Policy Advisor, about an important development that may have flown under the radar for a lot of folks. After considering a newly proposed model for measuring soil loss, USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, which we all know as NRCS, recently decided not to change its existing model for measuring soil loss. Of course, Rick knows all about it, and he's going to tell us why the decision is important for farmers. Rick, let's start with some background. Why was NRCS thinking about changing the soil loss model, and what are the key differences between the current model and the one that was proposed?
Well, NRCS said that it wanted the most current climate data used when estimating soil erosion. And the Water Erosion Prediction Project, or the WEP model, was a different model than the long-used revised Universal Soil Loss Equation version 2. And it had a longer climate time frame or record that it used. It went from 1974 to 2013. So WEP had that longer climate record that NRCS said it wanted to use. Russell II's climate record really only extended to 1992. So about 4 years ago, then, NRCS announced that it planned to transition from Russell II with a shorter climate record to WEP with a longer climate record. And it turned out that Russell II's climate record could have been updated, but no one really asked the Ag Research Services scientists responsible for Russell II to update its climate record. And what we found was what was really going on behind the scenes was a competition between two groups of scientists for the two different models.
You were concerned that the change in the soil loss model could adversely affect Iowa farmers. Why was that, Rick?
What we learned was that WEP did a poor job in accurately estimating soil erosion at the farm scale. WEP is a process-based model that tries to recreate soil erosion in an algorithm or mathematically. Russell II, on the other hand, is an empirically based model. It was built on decades of observed soil science at the plot and field scale. And when we started working with the ARS scientists to understand these differences, we found that WEP yielded soil erosion estimates that were as much as 100 to 400% more than Russell II for Iowa farms. And so then they tweaked it, they tweaked the algorithm, and the differences were down to 52% more. And so then they adjusted the algorithm again and got the differences down to about 41% between the two models. And then there was another comparison project involving more ARS scientists, and it was looking at more than just Iowa farms. And it found that WEP soil erosion estimates were 8 times higher than those from Russell II. So WEP also produced some strange results, such as high clay or high residue soils yielding higher soil erosion estimates. And these kinds of technical shortcomings from the use of WEP stood to knock farmers out of conservation compliance, literally overnight, due to no fault of their own. And this would have had dramatic implications for farmers' use of soil conservation cost share funding and the implementation of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy and access to crop insurance. And in addition, there were some policy questions about whether NRCS could change the use of the Russell II model without congressional approval. What it was doing was essentially changing the conservation compliance standard established by Congress.
Everyone wants more conservation and water quality practices on the fields in Iowa, but could this change in the soil loss model have created a disincentive for farmers to adopt conservation, or could it have eroded farmers' confidence in working with NRCS?
Oh yes, most definitely. That was one of our concerns. Imagine a farmer going into the NRCS office and being told that he or she has 40% more soil erosion on their farm compared with what they knew before, or compared to their neighbor with the same soils, topography, or cropping systems. The overnight use of WEP most definitely would have caused many farmers to doubt the expertise of the soil conservationists, technicians, and planners. It would have caused more farmers to not seek the advice of NRCS in their conservation planning needs.
Rick, what did you and others at Iowa Farm Bureau do to raise these concerns to officials at NRCS and other decision makers?
For more than 3 years, the Iowa Farm Bureau worked with ARS scientists to understand the differences between the two models. We had 4 separate studies of Iowa and U.S. soils and cropping systems run between the two models. We also shared these comparisons with other Midwestern state farm bureaus, and together we communicated our concerns to the NRCS leadership.
You mentioned that you worked with other farm bureaus and ag groups. Why was working in a coalition that way so important?
It takes a lot of patience and energy and political capital to push back against the federal agency successfully, especially on a highly technical issue such as this. One person or one organization we knew couldn't do it alone. And in the end, there were 15 state and national farm, commodity, and conservation organizations that asked NRCS to reconsider the switch from Russell II to WEP. The power of our combined voices really made a difference in this case.
You counted on sound science when you raised your concerns about the change in soil loss models. How did you gather that evidence that you needed to back up your concerns about the new soil loss model?
We just asked the questions and asked the scientists to do the comparison work. We communicated directly to the ARS scientists and asked them to do this work. We communicated directly to the NRCS leadership about our concerns as a result of the science. There was a number of scientists working in their own silos, it seems, at that time. And I think we got them working together and thinking together more. We got them thinking about all the implications of using a model with questionable, suspect, highly variable results. And when they couldn't answer why the results of the two models were so different, it was impossible for NRCS leadership to justify using WEP for conservation compliance and conservation planning needs.
So, Rick, what's next in this process? Is NRCS still considering a change in the soil loss model? And is there anything farmers should watch or anything they should do to keep current on this situation?
Well, NRCS has issued a bulletin to its staff saying that Russell 2 will remain the official NRCS tool for predicting soil erosion by water. And they are in the process of publishing this in the Federal Register and haven't done so yet, so we're going to have to continue to monitor this. But farmers can always ask their NRCS office, their soil conservationist, what is the model that's being used when they get an estimate from them about what their soil erosion is.
If farmers have a concern, Rick, who should they contact beyond their NRCS office? Are there people at Farm Bureau who can help them?
Of course, the staff at the Iowa Farm Bureau, including myself, can always answer questions that our members may have about this issue, about conservation compliance, about how to go about implementing the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and we can always help them with those questions.
I'm guessing most folks had no clue about the NRCS proposed model for measuring soil loss or the impact that it could have had. And quite frankly, how could you? When you're farming, you don't have the time to monitor every single proposal that could impact your farm operation. That's why you have a group like the Iowa Farm Bureau to be your watchdog, to amplify your voice, and to champion agriculture's interests during times like these. With that, I'll wrap up this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's interviews and that you'll join us for our next regularly scheduled episode on February 22nd. Between now and then, I want to remind you to register for our ongoing Economic Summit webinar series, to catch upcoming webinars with experts like Dr. Seth Meyer, who's the incoming chief economist for USDA. And of course, you can get registered right now by heading out to iowafarmbureau.com. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.